Good afternoon. My name is Cesar Garcia Hernandez. I'm extremely happy to welcome all of you here. It's so nice to see such a full house. This is the Rewriting Immigration Narratives discussion, and the first of our panels will begin momentarily on addressing the predicament of family immigration detention. Before we get started with the substantive programming, though, I want to give you all thanks for coming here, taking time out of your very busy schedules to discuss what is an extremely important and difficult issue. Difficult legally, difficult politically, and most importantly, difficult on a very human level, on the level of the impact that immigration detention and immigration enforcement policies have on human lives and the lives of people in our own communities. And to have this conversation, we have one person in particular to thank for, and that's Elizabeth Drogan, who is standing in the back, making sure that everything goes smoothly. So please join me in thanking Liz. It's fair to say that that we would not be here today gathered like this if it were not for the many hours of thankless effort that she has put into this. So thank you to Liz, and thank all of you, or I thank all of you for coming here tonight. I'm going to be moderating the first of our panels, Untold Stories of Family Detention and Deportation, and then turn it over to our wonderful list of panelists who are sitting here next to me. Who'll speak just in the order that they are listed in your program. Before I quickly introduce each of them, though, I want to provide a little bit of context into the topic of our panel's discussion. And that's the issue of immigration detention of families, the use of confinement as a way of enforcing immigration laws when it comes to family groups that are coming to the United States. Now, immigration detention is a central piece of immigration law enforcement and has been for quite some time, stretching at least into the early 1980s. What we see, though, is that in recent years, it has become a very central component of the policies of multiple administrations, including the Obama administration. And so I have a little bit of data up here on the screen that will provide some context for the much more detailed discussions that our panelists will follow us with. This information lists the number of people who see the inside of an immigration detention center in a given year, ranging from 2007 to 2013. That's the latest year for which we have data. And what we can see is that we hold a lot of people inside immigration detention centers over the course of a given year, upwards of 450,000 people in fiscal year 2013 alone. And that is a population that's spread out across the country in 250 or so facilities, including our very own facility here in Aurora, the Aurora Detention Center, but also in county jails throughout the country, so that these folks, even though they are being held allegedly because they violated some civil provision of immigration law, are held in situations or in conditions that look a lot like the conditions that people who are suspected of violating some crime are held in. And in fact, they're often held in the very same places, county jails. Now, there are a few legal justifications that are often provided for why it is that we are able to detain people even though they're not suspected of violating any crime. And two reasons in particular are traditionally provided. One is that the person might leave, might flee, might just disappear into the community, and we want to make sure that the federal government knows where they are and can actually make them appear for immigration court hearings. A second is that they're dangerous, that they might actually endanger the community while they're out, and immigration court proceedings are slowly making their way through the system. And those are the two justifications that are usually provided, but the Obama administration in the last few months has trotted out a third justification that we hadn't seen for quite some time, and that's deterrence. That's the idea that if we detain one person, it will keep another person from coming to the United States without permission. So let me just quote the statement that Secretary Jay Johnson of the Department of Homeland Security made to the U.S. Senate over the summer in July of last year. He was explaining the Obama administration's policy at the time, and he said, "We have an aggressive deterrence strategy focused on the removal and repatriation of recent border crossers." This is a statement that has been repeated in many different forms by Secretary Johnson as well as lower level officials in the Department of Homeland Security. It is a policy that is aimed at the people who are going to be the focus of this afternoon's panel. Women, children, mothers, fathers and siblings, people who are traveling to the United States as a family unit, the idea being that if we throw them behind barbed wire and under lock and key, then it will keep other people from primarily Central America coming here. Now, this is family detention is something that many advocates thought was a feature of our nation's history, not our nation's present. In 2009, the Obama administration closed what was a family detention center that was located in Hutto, Texas, sort of central Texas, thanks in large part to efforts by people like Lisa Graybill, who will be speaking on the next panel, and who's now a faculty member here at the DU Law School. When that Hutto facility closed, the administration was touted by advocates as taking a step in the right direction. The New York Times, in fact, described this step as the Obama administration's clearest departure from its predecessor's immigration enforcement policies. That is, ending family detention was what marked the Obama administration's immigration policies most distinctly from the Bush administration. Well, we've seen over the last few months a return to that past, where the administration opened quickly, hurriedly, a large family detention center in Artesia, New Mexico, located in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, and you'll hear more about that in a few minutes. The administration recently closed that in December. That was kind of an ad hoc facility, and instead it opened up a facility that is designed to be more long-term in remote Dilley, Texas. That facility is not at capacity yet, but when it is at capacity, it should reach about 2,400 people. So with that context, I'll turn it over to our panelists. We're going to start off with the gentleman on my left, Sean Ayes, who's a third-year student at the DU Law, and who has spent a good amount of time working with folks who are detained both at Artesia and Dilley. Then we'll turn it over to Jennifer Casey, who is an immigration attorney here in Denver, followed by Katie Dingaman-Cerda, who is on the faculty at the DU Department of Criminology and Sociology, and we'll close it off with Jeanette Vizguerra from the American Friends Service Committee. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Sean to the stage.
So just to give you a little bit of a background, I myself am an immigrant. I was born in the 1980s in El Salvador in the midst of a civil war. My father was one of the victims of this civil war. He went to work one day and he just disappeared. My family, like countless others, were caught in the middle of a civil war. And so my mother, fearing that we would suffer the same fate, made a 6,000 mile journey to the United States. We entered undocumented. She crossed the Rio Grande, and at the time I was a year old. And so she crossed the Rio Grande. It was kind of a swamp, walked through the desert for several hours, and eventually made our way to sort of a smuggling stop where we were loaded into a shipping container that was lined with ice. And the reason it was lined with ice is because the previous shipment people had suffocated because essentially they were in an oven and they were crossing through the desert. So she made her way. Eventually we ended up in New York. And so throughout the years we became legal residents. Eventually we became citizens. But during this time, for the period that we were undocumented, we lived in the constant terror of being deported. But as I mentioned to you, we eventually became citizens. I went to my undergraduate, and now I'm pursuing law school. During this time frame, things in El Salvador pretty much stayed the same. The cycle of violence continued. A lot of families that were broken up because of the violence continued. These kids were left orphaned, homeless. They grew up. They joined gangs to try to survive. And so the violence continued, and we still see that today. And that's sort of where my background is as far as the personal experience of why I relate to immigrants. My most recent experience occurred in Artesia, New Mexico. And our other panelists will discuss Artesia in detail, so I'll skip ahead on some of these. But just to give you an idea, we traveled, it was basically 8 hours in a car to this facility. The nearest city there is, in New Mexico, is 3.5 hours from the facility. The nearest just major city is in El Paso, which is 3 hours away. This community is in the middle of nowhere. It's primarily an oil and gas mining town. And it was built as a boot camp for federal law enforcement. It was meant to train officers. So it was never intended to be a detention facility for families. The facility itself was, the accommodations were brought up practically overnight. They received their orders, I believe it was on July 17th, and then on the 28th, they had already started receiving their first families. And so, just to give you an idea of who was detained there, and this is where I relate to the story, it was mothers and children. A lot of these kids, they're babies, some still in diapers, and then you have the complete opposite spectrum where you have teenagers, 16, 17-year-olds living with their mom. And basically they live in, mini jails with their parents. And for the same reason, they came to the United States because they were trying to escape violence. Gang violence, domestic violence, just general fear for their lives brought them here. And much like we came from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. I'll start off by just mentioning this letter that a girl that was detained there sent to President Obama, and this is published in Mother Jones, so if anyone wants to look at it, you can. But this letter was from Daniela. She had been detained when she sent this letter 2 months in Artesia. She had, when she was first detained, she weighed 75 pounds. Just almost 2 months later, she was down to 60 pounds. So that's basically, a quarter of her weight that she lost while in detention. And this was a very common thing that I saw when I was there. Kids just wouldn't eat. It's not because lack of food, it was just because the food was unappetizing and just the general depression that the kids are going through, right? They're jailed. These are kids in jail. They're restricted in their movements. They don't have the ability to, just play, to be kids. And at least when I was there, the schools had not been functioning. So these kids, were basically just detained with their parents all day long. And actually, I should say with their mothers because the fathers weren't there. That is one feature that was very common is fathers were detained elsewhere. So not only did you have families that had been broken up, but you had these kids who were just basically wasting away. And amongst the most heartbreaking stories that I heard was a mom that I spoke with who showed me that she ran her fingers through her baby's hair, and she showed me the hair that was falling out because the kids were wasting away. And she broke down and told me, every morning I pick him up, there's a ring of hair on his pillow because he's just wasting away. While we were there, we also had another instance where you saw a baby with a distended belly, things that you see stereotypically, in third world countries, not here in the United States. And it was for the same reason that the kids aren't eating, they're wasting away. And the parents aren't faring any better. They're also depressed because they're powerless to be able to help their kids. The guards are in charge, not the parents. So the guard tells you to keep your kids quiet, you have to comply. Otherwise, you lose privileges. You can't use cell phones to contact your family. You're not allowed, to roam about freely. And that's what I found that made it very difficult is that, I got lucky that my mom and I weren't detained when we came to the United States. These families, on the other hand, unfortunately, they're detained until they were processed, which that process could go for several months. They would be detained during that time period. So I'll skip these, but basically the trauma that they suffered was not only in having to be detained, but also at times just having to relive the horror, because as part of the process of, applying for asylum, you have to express the fear, the reason why you're being detained. And so this is sort of a model that I created, basically what the law office was. Back there, I'll sort of show you. So this is where you would have client meetings. You would essentially be sitting there talking with a mom and she's holding her baby. You'd have an ice guard back here, just overhearing everything you say, so there's no confidentiality. You have parents who have to tell you just their, most violent stories of, people being decapitated, their husbands, just the violence they endured, being beaten, being raped, and having to actually discuss it in meticulous detail. You also had other concerns where, for instance, one mom, she was a lesbian, or she is a lesbian, I apologize. And there, that was a very difficult topic to talk to other people about in public, because, people start talking, and it's difficult when you're surrounded with other people, and, that type of information is very sensitive, and it can have negative implications because of just the people that they were surrounded with. And so the moms just didn't have privacy. They would hold their kids, and these kids are hearing just these gruesome details of how people are being killed, how people are being abused. I remember hearing one story where a young boy found out that he was a product of rape because his mom had to tell the story, in order to talk to us. So the conditions themselves are just horrible. And the courtrooms, that was one of the things that is a bit of a joke. When we arrived, this was essentially the courtroom where things were held. The mom and her kids would sit at a table. They would be watching this monitor, and on the other end there would be an immigration judge trying to decide their future. Rarely did they have, prior to, or at least initially, there was no attorney. So these moms with an interpreter basically had to explain very complex legal, topics, and try to show that they were being persecuted and that they would, they merited asylum. But as you can see, that you're alone in a room, everything else is happening remotely. But yeah, so those were my experiences, and it was very trying. You want to help all these families, but in the end, you can only do so much. So. Thank you.
Hello. My name's Jennifer Casey. I am an immigration lawyer here in Denver, and like Sean, I also volunteered in Artesia, New Mexico in October is when I went down. And I am woefully underprepared. I don't have a PowerPoint, but Sean, I feel like the models that you've drawn up are rather incredible depictions of the facility itself, so thank you. In the spirit of the title of this panel today, Rewriting Immigration Narratives, I wanted to go through a few different things. First, I want to talk about the people that we're talking about that are detained in Artesia, now in Dilley, Texas. Who they are, why they've come here, and kind of dispel some of the reasons that we hear about in the press. And then I want to talk about legally what they need to demonstrate in order to be able to stay here, to get protection in the United States, what the legal criteria are. I want to talk about how we're supposed to treat people that are coming here seeking our protection. And then I think Sean's already done a pretty good job, but of contrasting that with how we're actually treating them. And we discuss a little bit of the impact of this, the detention and treatment of these individuals who have come to the United States seeking protection. So first of all, everybody's heard about the border crisis, right? The surge of Central American immigrants coming up through Mexico because they heard the rumor that they'll get a free pass and they can just cross the borders, easy as pie, and as soon as they get here, they'll get a work card, right? That's the reason. It's because the Obama administration is not tough on enforcement. And so, and I mean, there are different reasons given, but largely over the summer, that's what we were hearing in the press. And we need to nip this in the bud. And so I don't dispute that many people do come to the United States for economic reasons. Certainly there are many economic migrants coming to the United States. But this group of people that we're talking about, families, and primarily women and children from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the vast majority of them are not coming for economic reasons. The vast majority of them are fleeing very serious persecution in their home countries, and they're coming here because they need protection. And that has been largely missing from our narrative in the press, right? How we treat refugees is different and should be different than how we treat people that come to the United States to work and enter illegally, okay? But we all kind of got it all jumbled up in the press and kind of in the vitriol this summer. And so the response from our administration was, okay, well, we need to be seen as tough on enforcement, and so we are going to start detaining these people without really much regard for how we are supposed to treat refugees, people seeking protection in the United States. So I was going to read to you a couple of very specific case examples from individuals that were in Artesia that actually won claims for asylum. But I get super emotional, and I think that I'm going to maybe save that for the moment. And I want to talk to you about the legal piece because I don't want you to stand up here watching me cry. In order to gain protection in the United States, somebody has to establish that they meet the definition of a refugee. So under the United Nations Refugee Convention and Protocol, and then the Refugee Act of 1980 in the United States, an individual must establish that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, so serious harm, in their home country, that their government cannot protect them from this harm, or is either a perpetrator of the harm or cannot or will not protect them. And the harm has to be executed against these people for a specific reason. We call it a protected ground. So the law students, the immigration gurus here all know that. But there are 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. So it's not enough just to show that you have been repeatedly raped, but you have to show why your persecutor, why your rapist has raped you. What was the reason? And have you sought protection of the government? And has your government been able to protect you, for example? So it's a rather, it's a sophisticated legal case that you have to present once you get to the border. Now, we hear about refugee camps around the world, and those certainly exist, most notably probably right now in Syria, but we have a lot of refugees that have come to the United States from some of the African countries and from Burma as well, especially locally. But there's not really a good way for somebody from Central America right now, except for under a very new program that hasn't quite fully developed yet, to seek the protection, like let's say at a U.S. embassy in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, or San Salvador, to go and say, I'm a refugee, I need protection, can you please protect me? That mechanism really doesn't exist. And so the only way for people to get protection here is to come here, to come to our border, present themselves at the border or cross, and then present themselves to the Customs and Border Patrol officer that picks them up within 20 minutes of crossing the border, and ask for protection. And so I think that's an important thing to note as well. There's not really another way. Another thing that I want you to know is that these people are not just coming to the United States. Applications for asylum protection are up 700% in Belize, Nicaragua, Panama, and Costa Rica. So certainly many people are coming to the United States because of family connections, like Sean's, for example. I mean, there's a history of Central American migrants coming to the United States. So many people come here because of family connections and because the United States is a good place to live. But they're also fleeing their home countries and going to other Central American countries. So let's talk about the process. How does it work? A mother decides that it is either she has endured and her child has endured such severe domestic violence, which is epidemic throughout these countries, that there is very little protection by the police or of the state for women. if they are being abused by their spouses, partners, etc. They decide they can't take it anymore. They come to the United States. Or the gangs have run rampant in their neighborhood. They've waited outside their daughter's school and said, you're 14 years old, you are now my girlfriend. And if you're not my girlfriend, then I'm going to kill you, and I'm also going to kill your mother or your brother or your sister. And I'll do that. I'll show you that I'm capable of doing this by killing your neighbor who refused as well. So this is happening all the time. And so they leave. They come to the United States. They make a very dangerous journey up through some of the other Central American countries, up along the eastern coast of Mexico, often on trains with human smugglers. They endure oftentimes they endure very serious trauma in their journey. They come to the United States, they cross the border. In Artesia, and with many clients locally, I have yet to meet anyone who was not picked up by immigration within 2 hours of crossing the border. And so I think that that's an important thing to kind of recognize as well. Sure, there are people that are evading border protection, but our border's secure. We have a huge enforcement mechanism, and people are being picked up very quickly. And many times they voluntarily just turn themselves over and ask for protection. So I'm going to speed through. They get picked up by Customs and Border Protection. There's a lot of issues what goes on right there, but then they're transferred to these facilities, formerly in Artesia and now in Dilley, Texas. And once somebody's picked up, there is something in the immigration law called expedited removal. So if somebody's picked up within 100 miles of the border and they can't demonstrate that they're here legally, they can be returned to their home country essentially immediately, without any right to a hearing in front of an immigration judge, unless they express a fear of harm in their home country. And this is also important to know, right? So if I come across the border and I say, I'm here because I want to work, but I don't have permission, I'm going back to Mexico, I'm going back to Honduras, I'm going back to wherever it might be on the next flight or bus. If I say I fear harm, then I need to go through this other process, and it starts with something called a credible fear process, which is basically a screening to establish whether or not these people could have a significant possibility of receiving asylum. Have they been persecuted? Is it possibly on account of a protected ground? Have they established that the government cannot protect them? So they don't have to win the case at that point. It's a lower standard, but it's basically a screening. And it's these people that we're now keeping in these detention facilities. In the past, before the summer, basically between 2009 and 2014, our administration had decided that family detention was not in the public interest, and that people that had established a credible fear of harm really did have an incentive to appear in immigration court. Cesar spoke briefly about the flight risk issues. And now I'm being told I have to wind up. But we've obviously changed our tune in the effort to deter these individuals from coming to the United States. I can talk about this all day, so please do talk to me after the panel. And thank you very much for coming and for your interest and talk about this outside of this room. I mean, that's one of the thing that I really want to drive home here is not enough people are talking about this. It's a big problem. We hear felons, not families. That's what Obama says when he announces this executive immigration action, which is good for many people. But felons, not families rings really hollow for these families that are detained and are being rushed through a process where they're going to be deported back to a country where their lives are in danger. So thank you very much.
Hi, so my name is Katie Dingham-Cerda. I am a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. And I guess to give a little bit of my background, I am not an immigrant, but I have been a social worker. Prior to graduate school, I was a social worker for refugee families from the Middle East and from Africa. And then later I was a social worker for unaccompanied minors who were being held in immigration detention, especially in the form of foster care. And I became interested in questions of detention and removal during my tenure in that position. I saw numerous children, once they aged out of the foster care system, being deported back to Central America. And I came away wondering what happens to them when they get sent back to countries that they once fled for various reasons, because there weren't economic opportunities, or because there was persecution, or a family member died, or gang violence and whatnot. And going to grad school, I wanted to look to the literature. Are there any answers to this? And the literature did not have any answers to this. Nobody was really studying post-deportation yet, so I kind of took it on as my duty to go down to El Salvador and explore how individuals are reintegrating into their country of origin. So I come here not to share my own story, but to serve as a representative of the voices of the individuals that I interviewed for my dissertation, approximately 100 men who were deported since the emergence of what we're calling this deportation regime in the mid-1990s, and we're trying to build a home back in El Salvador. So this here is a graph that may be familiar to several individuals in this room. It shows the number of annual removals since the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924 to the present. And you can see, starting in the mid-1990s, the dramatic increase. And maybe Cesar will contextualize a little bit later. I don't have time now to talk about what happened in the 1990s and why we see such an emergence. But there have been exclusionary laws throughout U.S. history, but now we can say qualitatively that this is a new era. So I'll be focusing particularly on the Salvadoran case, and so I wanted to show representation that removals to El Salvador have been following a similar pattern. Salvadorans, despite the small size of this Central American country, they're one of the largest foreign-born populations in the United States. They're the third largest Hispanic, the second largest undocumented population, and they're the fourth largest, most deportable population, with approximately 20,000 people deported annually within the last half decade or so. The population as a whole is highly deportable in the US, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but when they initially fled the Civil War en masse in the 1980s, due to geopolitical concerns, the United States denied them systematically refugee status and then later granted kind of uneven status to the population. So almost 50% of the population remains undocumented, and about 75% is eligible for removal if they commit some sort of deportable crime. So what is the context of return like in El Salvador? What I'm showing you here is a picture of a national monument in San Salvador called Hermano Lejano, or the Distant Brother, which is erected in the wake of the Salvadoran Civil War to pay homage to the migrant. It's kind of the sacrificial lamb for the Salvadoran state. The migrant maintains the economy, the post-war economy of El Salvador, with the remittances that the migrants send back to the country of origin. And the sign says, Hermano, bienvenido a casa, brother, welcome home. So you would assume that these individuals, when they do return, there's some kind of warm welcome for them. But my data says that that is not the case. In fact, it's exactly the opposite, at least for individuals who are involuntarily returned. A little bit more quickly, because there's not enough time, about context. El Salvador is an incredibly beautiful, geographically and culturally rich country. It's also one of the most industrialized countries in the region. These are some pictures that I took and stole from the internet. But it's also a country that during the 1980s was torn apart by civil war. And it's a country that's still trying to figure out how to remember that war and make sense of that war and move forward in progressive ways in the wake of that war. So what you can see here are some images from some museums that I visited in San Salvador, remembering the tragedy of the war. Approximately 75,000 people murdered, and about a quarter of the population fled to the United States. And so the country is still struggling with many of the problems that initially gave rise to unrest. There's high levels of inequality So amidst opulence and wealth and Americanization, which is ever present, there remains rampant poverty, landlessness, marginalization, and repression. The Civil War, as Sean alluded, has transformed into a gang war. The guerrilla, who was once stigmatized, is now represented by the gangster, who is wreaking havoc on Salvadoran society and giving birth to this large outmigration of unaccompanied minors that we're seeing today. The Salvadoran state has responded to the gang phenomenon with heightened repression, declaring gang membership illegal, sponsoring death squads, hunting down, strip searching individuals who carry any markers of gang membership. And many people argue that the levels of violence in El Salvador today are higher than they were during the Civil War. So I want to share a few stories. I hope I have enough time. The first is probably a story that we're quite familiar of. We've been hearing a lot about the dreamers, the so-called dreamers. So this is Freddie. I allowed him to choose his pseudonym, and he chose Freddie, which tells you something about his identity. He migrated to the U.S. in the middle of the Civil War at the age of 5. He reported no memories of life in El Salvador prior to migration. He grew up in Los Angeles, described himself as a typical American. His family enforced English only in the household. He didn't learn any Spanish until high school when he had to take a foreign language requirement. His friends, he claimed, were mostly white kids. He graduated high school. He started attending community college. He was working in catering. It was his dream to go to France and study to be a prestigious chef and to come back and to open up his own restaurant in LA. But after a college party at a local bar, he was arrested for public intoxication and he was deported for not having papers. And he was sent back to a country that he knew nothing about and he had no connections to. He reported feeling betrayed by the government, the US government, that he believed to be his own. He says, quote, "It's a horrible feeling. It's like you know you'll be so far away from your family and friends. Your whole life is just ripped in front of you. They pull you out of everything you know in your life. They take your life from you." So when Freddie actually returned to El Salvador, he was treated as a foreigner and as a gangster. He had a few visible tattoos on his neck, which he claimed were non-gang related. He was stopped and strip searched multiple times. He was robbed and beat up by gang members, local gang members. He was treated as though he was a gangster by the general public. He was denied employment at local employment. So he returned to the US. He fled El Salvador again. He returned to the US and he was almost immediately deported again. And when he came back the second time, he started behaving like a tourist. He wore sunglasses so that he didn't have to make contact with anyone. He lived off the remittances of his family, credit cards from his family. He only ate at American restaurants, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut. I interviewed him in Pizza Hut. And he was seeking employment in a foreign-owned call center, which was known for hiring deportees regardless of their criminal status, but he had yet to gain such employment. He was among the few that was relatively financially privileged, and so his family was working to arrange a flight for him to Italy, where they would try to legalize him in Italy, and he could wait out the 20-year ban on his legal reentry to the U.S. He planned to come back to the U.S., write a memoir about his experiences as a deportee, and eventually become a chef. But I think, like many of the dreamers that we've been hearing about, it's probably a shattered life and a dream deferred. So. And I can share lots more. I have like 6 more stories, so in the question and answer. Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Bueno, mi nombre es Janet Vizguerra y
Vizguerra.
yo soy el rostro y la
I am
voz
the
de todo
face
lo que han hablado
and
aquí
the
los
voice
otros
of
compañeros.
everything that people have talked
Tengo
about.
solo 10 minutos,
I
mi
only
historia
have 10
es muy
minutes.
larga,
My story is
entonces
pretty
la voy a
long,
resumir
but
en un
I'll
tiempo
try to
muy
shorten
corto. Creo que lo más
I
relevante,
believe
ya
that
que
the most
no
important
acabaría
is,
de contar mi
since I
historia,
won't be
tiene
able to
muchos
tell my whole
detalles
story,
que
because there are a
si
lot
los
of
conocieran,
details.
mucha
If you
gente
knew about
saldría
them,
llorando de
you
aquí.
would be crying.
Entonces voy a hablar lo
So
más,
I'll try
resumir mi historia lo más poco que se pueda. Yo soy originaria de la Ciudad de México. Llegué aquí en el año 99 y no fue por cosas económicas. Mi esposo, trabajando en el transporte público como el RTD aquí, sufrió 3 secuestros express y fue por seguridad. En ese tiempo teníamos una niña de 6 años. Él vino primero en el año 97. Después vinimos a alcanzarlo nosotros 3 meses después. Desde que llegamos aquí hemos trabajado muy fuerte, muy duro. Hemos hecho lo que hace cualquier persona como ustedes. Pagar impuestos. Tratar de no meternos en problemas con la ley. Tratar de acoplarnos al sistema, bueno, menos hablar el inglés, ¿verdad? Porque todavía no lo aprendo. Y trabajado muy duro. Durante ese tiempo tuvimos la oportunidad de trabajar bien, hacer todo correcto. Creamos una pequeña compañía donde pudimos dar empleo a varias personas y estuvimos muy bien como hasta 2007. Vino lo de las Torres Gemelas y la economía bajó. Tuvimos que cambiar de ciudad. Vivíamos en Arvada y movernos a Aurora porque pues es más económico. Desafortunadamente, teniendo ya 15 años viviendo aquí, mi esposo es sobreviviente de cáncer, teniendo 2 trabajos porque parecía que el cáncer había regresado. Saliendo de mi segundo trabajo, recuerdo bien el tiempo, 10:18 de la noche, hablé para decir que iba a casa. En ese tiempo tenía 2 niños pequeños más, una niña de 5 años, uno de 3 años. La mayor ya tenía 21 años y ya estaba casada. Dije que ya iba para la casa. Saliendo de mi segundo trabajo, me detiene una patrulla. Yo pensé, pues, traía mis stickers vencidos, tal vez me va a dar un ticket, voy a mi corte, pago la corte y no pasa nada. Desafortunadamente, la primera pregunta que hizo el policía: ¿estás legal o ilegal en este país? Antes de pedir mis documentos. Sabiendo mis derechos, ya que he estado muy involucrada con la comunidad, he sido activista en derechos laborales y derechos de los inmigrantes. Le dije que iba a guardar mi derecho de mantenerme callada y no iba a responder más nada. Me volvió a preguntar: ¿estás legal o ilegal en el país? Dije: solo voy a dar mi nombre real, mi fecha de nacimiento y es todo lo que le puedo dar. Me pidió en ese momento los documentos. Al no tener una licencia de manejar válida de Colorado, entregué mi matrícula consular y dijo que iba a ir a revisar mi récord. En ese momento, yo intuí que no iba a regresar a mi casa por la pregunta que me había hecho al principio. Puse muy rápido mi teléfono en speaker y pude decir a mi esposo lo que estaba pasando y la pregunta que me había hecho. Dije que si no regresaba a casa, que por favor cuidara a mis hijos. El policía regresó, me bajó del carro y me detuvo. Era a la altura de Parker y Arapaho. La cárcel es muy cerca de ahí. Me empezaron a procesar y ahí cambió mi vida en 5 minutos. Entre la cárcel e inmigración duré 34 días detenida, donde solo en las cortes podía ver a mis hijos a lo lejos sin poderlos abrazar. Mis niños solo me mandaban besos así a lo lejos y era muy duro porque nunca nos habíamos separado como familia. Desde adentro pude orientar a mi esposo de qué hacer. Después de 34 días tenía una fianza en inmigración de $7,000. $7,000 que no teníamos por el problema de que pensábamos que mi esposo había regresado el cáncer. Mi esposo consiguió con amigos, con familiares. En mi primera audiencia pedí al juez que me bajara la fianza, le pude explicar mi situación y me la bajó a $4,000. Pude salir bajo fianza. Y peleé mi caso muy duro con la ayuda de la comunidad. En 2011, la juez me da la decisión de mi caso diciendo que tenía que regresar a mi país y la razón era porque creía que mis hijos no iban a sufrir, ya que eran muy pequeños y podían acoplarse a cualquier lado. Una persona totalmente ajena a mi vida, a mi entorno. Estaba tomando la decisión de cambiar mi vida, la de mi familia y la de la gente que me rodea. Obviamente no acepté esa decisión y puse una apelación. Desafortunadamente en 2013, después de 15 años sin ver a mi madre, me avisan de México que ella estaba en fase terminal de cáncer y era una decisión difícil. Pensar que tenía mi caso abierto, pensar que a mi madre le faltaban, podía ser un día o dos para morir y que así no la iba a ver. Y era una decisión tan fuerte y tan dura, pero mi corazón me decía que tenía que ir. En ese momento no me estaba importando los papeles o la situación. Desafortunadamente, las emergencias siempre nos agarran sin dinero. No podía llevar a mis hijos conmigo porque no tenía el dinero para pagar todos los pasajes. Decidí ir a ver a mi madre. Creo que fue lo correcto. Batallé mucho en México con la delincuencia, sin encontrar trabajo, sufriendo discriminación en mi propio país. Decidí regresar porque había perdido a mi madre y sentía que estaba perdiendo a mis hijos. Con la ayuda de la comunidad, decidí regresar, juntando el dinero para regresar como lo hace uno. Desafortunadamente, después de estar caminando por 4 días con sus noches, con los pies sangrando, ya casi sin fuerzas, por montañas, por desiertos, nos detuvo la patrulla fronteriza. Teniendo mi apelación pendiente, tuve que estar detenida ahí por más de un mes, esperando a que dieran la decisión de si cancelaban mi apelación. Volví a acudir con la comunidad, estando dentro del centro de detención. Trabajé yo muy duro adentro, pero la comunidad afuera. Estuve a 3 horas a punto de ser deportada. Pero algo en un momento cambió de todo el trabajo que hizo la comunidad, que hice yo, y me dejaron salir bajo supervisión. Al tener un mes de estar aquí, a ir a mi primer supervisión, me volvieron a detener aquí. Estuve nuevamente 1 semana y media detenida, donde la comunidad trabajó muy duro, pero han sido 3 veces que he tenido que pagar por algo que no es un crimen. El haber salido a ver a mi madre no me hace una prioridad. Y al pasar eso, me quedé con una orden final de deportación sin tener ningún alivio legal para poder pelear mi caso. Pero ahorita lo que me está soportando es todo el apoyo de la comunidad que he tenido que acudir a elegidos del gobierno. He tenido que hacer todo el trabajo comunitario que me toca hacer, como lo estoy haciendo ahorita, de ser la cara y el rostro de este problema de inmigración. Porque soy una madre que lo único que he venido es a trabajar, a darle lo mejor que puedo a mi familia. Y eso no me hace ser una criminal. El sistema está roto, no sirve en este momento y ahorita no soy solo yo. Tengo aquí a una madre de familia que su esposo tuvo que acudir a entrar a una iglesia, la primera persona que ha entrado a santuario aquí en Denver, ya que santuario lo crié yo basado en mi caso, si yo lo necesitaba. Afortunadamente no lo he necesitado, pero alguien más lo necesitó. Es horrible tener que estar metido ahí, soportando cosas para poder resistir su deportación. Al mismo tiempo, en esta semana, el día de hoy, yo estoy sometiendo documentación para una nueva extensión de tiempo, ya que el 1 de febrero se termina mi extensión, para ver si puedo continuar con mi familia. Al mismo tiempo, Arturo Hernández lo está haciendo y otra familia más. En esta semana siguiente, 3 familias, nuestro futuro lo van a decidir, como dije, personas totalmente ajenas a nosotros. En este momento estamos llenos de angustia, de dolor, de ansiedad, de no saber qué va a pasar con nosotros, porque no soy solo yo, es mi familia, la gente que me rodea, mi comunidad. No pierden solo a una persona, pierden una persona que ha ayudado a muchas más, que sigue trabajando muy fuerte para la comunidad, haciéndolo mejor. Entonces el día de hoy también estoy aquí para hacer un llamado a la comunidad a apoyarnos, a luchar por nuestros casos.
We have a few minutes remaining before we started a few minutes late. So if we all have some questions, I think we have time for maybe one or two. So please raise your hands and I'll call in. Or don't raise your hands, and that will make it easier. Yes?
Well, I guess a lot of us are students in classes regarding immigration, so maybe what are some things that we could do as young people who aren't in the career field yet to sort of help with this issue?
Excellent question.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, can you hear me? Yes. So many of the people in the room are students taking classes on immigration, learning about immigration for the first time. And so they're wondering what they can do, how they can get actively involved in the community. And so one of the goals of this symposium is to put together a student action group. And at the end of the two panels, we'll be passing around a sign-up sheet for any interested students or community members, and we'll arrange another time for all of us to get together and brainstorm exactly what ways we can get involved. So if you feel angry about the injustices that you're hearing about, do approach me or any other panelists that you see, and we'll talk about it further later.
You can also contact your senators, contact your representatives. I mean, we're still lacking any type of immigration reform. We need immigration reform on a whole host of levels, but many of the issues that we've talked about here, issues that directly impact Jeanette and some of the cases that Sean and I discussed, and Katie as well. So, I mean, sometimes we can feel pretty disheartened by how the political process works, but many, if not most of the people here are U.S. citizens, and your senators and representatives will listen to you. So I mean, that's another piece, is contact your political representatives.
Otra manera de ayudar, y lo pueden hacer.
Another way to help.
Perdón. Lo pueden hacer hoy mismo.
You
Las
can do this
familias
today.
aquí afectadas,
The families that
estamos
have been
circulando una
affected, we
petición
are,
física donde
submitting a
colectamos firmas
petition, and
que
we're
van a toda la
collecting forms that
documentación
go
de
to
nuestro file para
with the
soportar nuestros
documentation
casos.
of our cases,
En mi caso
to
también
support our
traigo
case.
un resumen
And I
de mi
also have
historia,
a summary of my
porque
story.
parte de mi trabajo como
Part of
líder
my
comunitario
job as a
es ir a
community
todos
leader
los lugares
is to go
que me
to the
inviten
places where I'm
para educar a
asked to
la
go
comunidad.
to educate the
Como
community.
dijo la compañera, también
Like my
pueden
partner said, you can
ir a los grupos promigrantes, grupos comunitarios.
community groups.
A veces hacemos
Sometimes
alertas de acción
we
como
also
llamadas
call for
a los
action.
elegidos, senadores, congresistas,
This is for our
a
senators,
ICE local,
congressmen,
a ICE
local
nacional,
governments,
para
ICE
parar las
local, ICE
deportaciones de
national,
la gente
to
en
stop
procesos.
deportation of
Hay
people
muchas
who are
cosas
going
que se
through
pueden
these
hacer,
processes. There are a
y
lot
si
of things that
alguien
you
quiere
can do,
involucrarse
and if
más,
you would
pueden
like to be
acercarse
involved,
a
please come to
nosotros,
me.
porque nosotros
Because
somos las
we are
personas que
the
podemos
ones
decirles mejor que
who can
nadie
tell you
cómo
better than
involucrarse,
anyone
ya
how
que
to get
somos las
involved,
personas
because we are the
afectadas.
ones that are being
Pero
affected.
también no lo haríamos
But we wouldn't be doing
sin la
this
ayuda de muchos de
without the
ustedes,
help of a lot of
sin
you,
mucha gente americana
without
que
the
no
US
tiene ninguna
citizens
necesidad de
who
hacerlo, pero que
don't really have the
sienten
need to do this,
una
but they
responsabilidad
feel the
moral
responsibility,
de
they
hacer
have the moral
algo
responsibility
por todas
to do
estas
something
familias.
for these families.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has something burning. Yes.
I just want to mention, this is another petition for that Ana Sosameva. She's going to talk in a minute about her case, but her husband is Arturo Hernandez, is in sanctuary here in Denver. And he was just denied the reopening of his case by the federal court, and so is now going to petition for a stay of deportation, which is what Jeanette's talking about. So I'll pass this around too if people want to sign the petition.
So with that, I just want to take a moment to also invite you to consider attending a 2-day symposium that will be happening at the law school just across the street, February 6th and 7th. It's a Friday and Saturday, and it's about how criminal law and immigration law intersect with one another. With that, I'll ask you all to please join me in thanking our panelists